There's a place so cursed the maps won't mark it, and men who ride through it swear the land itself watches them leave. It sat sunken between two cragged ridges of blood-red stone, their jagged peaks reaching skyward, like grasping hands frozen mid-scream. The old folks called it Six Nails, named for the 6 rusted spikes hammered into the beam of its gallows long ago, when law and mercy both abandoned this forsaken patch of earth. Dust hung thick in the air, dulling the sun's glare, but offering no kindness. The wind carried the scent of old blood and dry rot, rattling loose shutters, like bones clacking in the dark. Six Nails was a town that had died and refused to lie down. Years ago, it had been a mining camp, flush with gold and crawling with men willing to kill for a nugget the size of a thumbnail. But greed turned on itself, as it always does. The massacre came in the dead of one summer night, when the canyon walls drank in the screams of women and children, and the men spilled each other's guts in the alleys. In the end, the survivors buried the dead, boarded the windows, and left behind a place too mean to be forgotten and too cursed to be remembered. But a few stayed. Ezekiel Mott was one of them. The man had once worn a sheriff's star, though rumor held he took it from the cooling body of the lawman he gutted in the massacre's last hours. Now he called himself mayor, a self-styled king in a kingdom of dirt and ruin. Mott's rule was made of lead, whiskey, and fear. His men swaggered through the streets in dust-crusted gun belts, laughing too loud and staring too long at anything that flinched. And chained like a dog to a rusted trough outside the warped remains of the old saloon, sat Delilah Voss. She was a rough-boned beauty, with hair the color of fresh gunpowder and eyes sharp enough to cut a man's throat. Some whispered she was the daughter of a backwoods murderer. Others said she'd slit her own husband's throat and set his shack ablaze before dawn. The truth was harder and sadder than any of them guessed, but no one cared to know it. In Six Nails, a good rumor lasted longer than a man's last breath. Delilah's wrists were bound with iron cuffs rubbed raw against her skin, a chain bolted to the trough, where the town's mongrel dogs lapped mud-thick water. She wore a threadbare blouse and a skirt stained with dust and blood. The townsfolk passed her by like she was a weathered post. Some spat, some laughed. A few tossed coins or curses. It was Mott's way of making a point. Keep something pretty in chains, where every man could see it. Remind folks who ruled the dirt and who begged for scraps. That afternoon, the sun hung low and mean in the sky, and the heat bled the color from the world. The air shimmered, bending the shapes of buildings like a drunken painter's brushstroke. And then he came. A pale horse, lean and scarred like something out of an old preacher's nightmare, stepped into town with a rider cloaked in a ragged, dust-streaked duster. A wide-brimmed hat drooped low over his face, casting it in permanent shadow. His boots made no sound in the dust. The townsfolk stilled. Conversations faltered. Mott's men stiffened, hands straying toward their weapons. The stranger rode straight down the middle of the crooked street, the pale horse's hooves kicking up little clouds of sunlit grit. He passed the leaning chapel, its steeple canted like a drunkard's cap, and the livery stable where half-dead nags twitched in the shade. He didn't glance at the saloon, or the men gathered on its porch with whiskey-stained teeth and eyes like stones. But when he came to Delilah, his horse slowed. For a long, brittle moment, he just sat there, staring down at the woman chained to the trough. Delilah lifted her chin, defiance hard as iron in her gaze, though her throat was dry and her arms ached from the sun. She waited for him to spit, or laugh, or offer some grimed coin for a touch. He did none of those things. The stranger dismounted without a word. Dust clung to his coat like old sins. The wind rose, tugging at his hat, but he kept his face hidden. The nearest man, a fat, red-faced brute named Cotton Doyle, stepped off the saloon porch and called out, "You lost, stranger? Or are you fixin' to leave something behind?" The stranger didn't look his way. He knelt by the trough, one gloved hand resting on the rusted chain. The other reached beneath his coat and drew a knife. Not a quick little gambler's blade. This was a long, ugly thing, its edge notched and dark with old stains. Delilah's breath caught. The townsfolk edged closer, a circle of leering faces, expectant and eager for blood. The stranger sliced through the chain with one clean stroke. The ring of broken metal was loud in the still air. A few townsmen gasped. Doyle's face purpled, his hand flying to his gun. The stranger rose and spoke for the first time, his voice low and worn like weathered stone. "Ride beside me." For a moment, no one moved. Then weapons were drawn. Revolvers cleared leather. Blades flashed in the sun. The saloon doors banged open, and Mott's men came spilling out, the stink of cheap whiskey and mean living thick on them. The drifter, for that's what they would call him in the stories afterward, stood his ground, the long knife in one hand, his pale horse waiting, and Delilah on her knees beside him. The air was tight as a noose about to snap, and in that hung moment, the town of Six Nails held its breath. For a heartbeat after those words, "Ride beside me," nothing moved. The world held its breath, save for the restless shifting of horses and the creak of leather. Then Delilah Voss did something no one expected. She stood. Her knees wobbled from hours in the dust, and her wrists bled where the cuffs had bitten. But she snatched up the nearest discarded revolver, a battered old Colt with a worn grip, and crossed to the pale horse. The drifter swung into the saddle without a word, and with a final glance at the faces of the men who jeered, spat, and let her rot in the dirt, Delilah grabbed a half-lame buckskin mare and scrambled onto its back. Cotton Doyle bellowed, "Cut him down." Gunfire cracked like dry branches, and then they were off. They bolted down the main street of Six Nails, hooves kicking up a storm of dust. The townsfolk dove for cover as Mott's men gave chase. Lead whined through the air, splintering porch posts and chipping stone walls. A bullet grazed the drifter's shoulder, darkening the fabric of his coat. He didn't flinch. The canyon mouth yawned ahead, a narrow passage of jagged stone and dry brush leading into a twisting maze of cliffs and gullies. The drifter veered his pale horse toward it without hesitation, and Delilah followed, heart pounding so hard it drowned out the roar of pursuit. Behind them, Mott's men cursed and fired, but none dared follow far into No Man's Canyon. Folks around those parts knew better. The place wasn't marked on any map. A tangled, blood-red hellscape of stone spires and deep ravines, it wound for miles through the Badlands like some ancient god's boneyard. The locals called the towering formations the Watchers, jagged rock shapes twisted into the likeness of frozen men and beasts. They seemed to leer from the shadows, and no posse sent in after outlaws ever came out whole. Some didn't come out at all. Dust devils danced in the heat. The sun painted the canyon walls with streaks of crimson and gold as the riders galloped deeper into the maze. Finally, when the gunfire behind them faded into nothing, the drifter slowed his pale horse to a steady trot. Delilah kept pace, her buckskin heaving and slick with sweat. The silence pressed heavy. Only the wind spoke, sighing through the crevices and arches like the murmurs of old bones. It was Delilah who broke it. "You aim to get us both killed in here," she rasped, her throat raw from dust and thirst. The drifter didn't turn his head, rather in here than on a rope. She swallowed hard, glancing back the way they'd come. No sign of pursuit now, just the crooked fingers of the canyon behind them. "I need to know what you want," she said. "Why me?" The drifter's voice was low, rough. "Didn't much care for how they had you chained like a cur." Delilah almost laughed, though it caught in her throat like broken glass. "You don't know what I did." "Don't have to," he replied. "I know what they are." They rode in silence a while longer, the sun bleeding toward the horizon. At last, Delilah spoke again, her voice a little softer. "They said I poisoned Sheriff Darnell," she began. "Found him dead in his room, foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog. They blamed me, claimed I slipped laudanum in his bottle." The canyon walls caught her voice and tossed it back in whispers. "But it wasn't you," the drifter said, a statement, not a question. "No," she stared ahead, jaw tight. "Was Mott. Man came to my room 2 nights before. Wanted things. I told him I'd rather rot than lie with a swine like him. Next thing I know, Darnell's cold, and Mott's pointing a finger my way. Whole town eager to believe it. No one spoke for me. Not even the preacher. Chained me up like an animal." The drifter said nothing, his pale horse stepping easy among the loose stones. "And you?" she asked. "What's your story, stranger?" He didn't answer for a long while. Then, heading to a place called Whisper's Grave. Delilah's stomach tightened at the name. Every backwater town and trading post for 50 miles whispered of it. A dead settlement sunk into the earth, where nothing grew and no man dared linger. The ground that was said to drink blood like water. Why, she asked. Things buried their need unearthing. Before she could press him, a sharp crack split the air. The buckskin mare screamed and staggered, a bullet tearing a bloody groove along its flank. An ambush. From the shadows of a rock arch, 5 armed men burst forth, rifles barking. Not Mott's usual pack. These were harder men, with scarred faces and cold eyes. Bounty hunters hired on the quiet. They aimed to claim a reward for the woman and the strange rider both. The drifter moved like a ghost, his duster flaring as he spun from the saddle, twin revolvers appearing in his hands as if conjured from the dust. Shots rang out. One bounty hunter crumpled with a hole between the eyes. Another fell clutching his throat, dark blood pumping through his fingers. The drifter ducked behind a slab of stone as bullets screamed past. Delilah threw herself from her horse, landing hard but keeping hold of the colt. She braced against a boulder, aimed for the man reloading behind a pillar of rock. For a moment her hand shook, then she fired. The slug struck the bounty hunter just beneath his eye. He collapsed without a sound. The fight was savage and close, the echoes of gunfire bouncing wild between the stone towers. Dust filled the air. Men screamed, cursed, bled into the cracked earth. When it ended, only the drifter, Delilah, and the dead remained. She stood, chest heaving, sweat streaking her dirt-caked face. The drifter reloaded in silence, eyes ever watchful. As they mounted up again, Delilah saw him pull a handkerchief from his pocket and press it to a fresh wound on his arm. The cloth came away dark, not red, but a deep, unnatural black. She said nothing. Not yet. Midnight hung heavy over Redstone Gulch, the blood moon swollen and cruel as it climbed high above the horizon. It painted the land in a sickly crimson glow, as though the desert itself bled under the weight of old sins. The shadows stretched long, twisting and clawing across cracked earth and splintered fences, and not a single cicada dared to chirp. Even the wind held its breath. Along the railroad tracks outside town, Silas Crowley and his men spread out like wolves around a wounded animal. Some crouched behind boulders, others took position in dry gullies or flattened themselves atop the rocks. Each man held a rifle or pistol, cocked and ready. The rails gleamed faintly, the cold metal beginning to tremble under the distant weight of an approaching train. Silas stood near the chained figure of Eleanor Voss, his pale face grinning in the blood-colored light. The iron chain binding her wrists and ankles rattled as she worked a jagged rock against a rusty link, every scrape hidden by the noise of the coming engine. "You hear that, darlin'?" Silas sneered, kicking a loose stone toward her. "That's your chariot Callan. Better start praying that." Eleanor didn't answer. Her lips were split, dirt streaked her face, and her left eye was nearly swollen shut. But she ground the rock harder, feeling the metal weaken under each desperate scrape. Out in the darkness, Jonah Cross moved like a shadow stitched from the earth itself. His boots crunched softly in the dust, his head tilted as he listened, not just for the sound of men, but for the small things. The rasp of breath, the faint scent of sweat carried on the dry wind, the telltale click of a rifle hammer drawn back too soon. He counted them. There were 6 on the left, behind a cluster of boulders. 3 more crouched along a dried-out riverbed, and another 4 stationed up on the rocks that flanked the rails. The train's whistle screamed in the distance, a long, mournful note that made the hairs on the back of Jonah's neck rise. In the hush of the moment, a soft tap came against Jonah's boot. He stopped. "Jonah," a boy's voice whispered. It was Caleb Weaver, a skinny orphan no older than 10, his face smudged with dust and his wide eyes reflecting the blood-red moonlight. Caleb clutched a stick like a rifle and looked up at the blind gunman as if seeing a legend rise from the grave. "I seen where they're hiding," the boy breathed. 3 behind them big rocks yonder, 2 in the gulch by the dead cottonwood, couple more on the slope near the rail trestle. Jonah crouched slightly, his face unreadable behind the dark lenses. "You did good, boy. Now get back. And stay low." Caleb hesitated only a second before darting off into the darkness, quick and silent as a jackrabbit. Jonah straightened, turning his head toward each spot Caleb had named. He committed them to memory, picturing the ground by feel and sound, plotting distances by the heaviness of bootfalls and the creak of leather. From down the track, the train loomed closer. The rhythmic thunder of the wheels grew louder, the rails humming like a stretched fiddle string. It would be upon them in minutes. Cross. Silas's voice cracked across the night like a whip. Last chance, you blind bastard. I can put you down right here. Or you can turn around and crawl back to whatever hole you've been hiding in. Jonah's hand rested on the ivory grip of his Colt. He let the silence stretch, the air between them thick as molasses, before answering. I didn't come here to crawl. Jonah called evenly. I came to bury you. A harsh laugh rose from the hidden riders. They were sure of their numbers, certain in the dark. To them, Jonah was just an old relic, a crippled legend barely worth the bullet. The train's headlamp came into view, a white eye piercing the gloom, and the shriek of its whistle sounded again, closer now, urgent and angry. Eleanor's hands ached, but the chain finally gave a brittle crack as a weakened link splintered. She stifled a gasp and worked to free her ankles. Her heart pounded in time with the approaching train. Jonah took a deep breath, the air dry and heavy on his tongue. He could smell them now. The sharp tang of gun oil, the sour sweat of fear and adrenaline, the faint reek of tobacco on Silas's breath. Every sound stood out, the shifting of boots, the press of a trigger. He moved. In one swift motion, Jonah drew his Colt, the polished ivory grip catching the crimson light. He fired. The first shot wasn't aimed at a man. It struck a lantern hanging from a pole by the tracks, plunging the scene into sudden shadow. The riders cursed, caught half-blind as their night-adjusted eyes struggled against the sudden darkness broken only by the blood moon's sickly glow. Jonah's second shot rang out before the glass hit the ground. A rider behind the rock screamed and collapsed, a bullet finding his throat by the sound of his ragged breath. The desert exploded in gunfire. Rifles cracked, bullets tearing through the night air, kicking up dust and sparks from stone. Jonah moved like water, each step calculated by the sense of earth underfoot and the echo of each shot. He fired again, striking a man on the slope near the trestle, the outlaw's death cry lost beneath the roar of the oncoming train. A shot grazed Jonah's shoulder, spinning him half a step. He dropped to one knee, rolling aside as another bullet shattered the ground where he'd stood. In the confusion, Eleanor kicked free of her ankle chain. Her fingers found a fallen revolver, cold, heavy, but welcome in her grip. Silas, cursing and furious, fired wildly toward the town, calling out to his men, "Kill him. He ain't no ghost, bleed him dry." But they were losing their nerve. The legend of Jonah Cross, blind or not, was bleeding back into the night like smoke. Every shot that dropped one of their own sent another shard of fear through the survivors. Jonah reloaded with swift, practiced hands, his ears tracking the fading positions of the riders. He knew he had them. He could smell it in the shift of the air. The train screamed into sight, its massive bulk and unstoppable force, the engine's lanterns searing the gloom. Steam hissed, the ground trembling with its weight. Jonah raised his Colt one final time. "Last warning," he called, his voice like thunder over the rails. "Free the woman, or the train hits you first." And this time no one laughed. The night shattered with Jonah Cross's opening shot, a single, perfect bullet cracking through the brittle air and striking the lantern on its post. The glass burst in a spray of sparks and flame, plunging the tracks into sudden darkness. The blood moon above cast a deep, crimson pall over the earth, but to most men's eyes, the world vanished in shadow. For Jonah, it was the same as it had been for years, a canvas of darkness painted with sound, scent, and the way the ground shifted beneath his feet. The outlaws cursed, their boots scraping against dirt and stone as they scrambled for cover. Jonah's Colt barked again, and a man's scream answered, cut short by a wet, choking gurgle. Another round roared from the darkness, and a second rider fell, his rifle clattering down the rocky slope. Jonah moved like a predator, one step at a time, his head tilted to catch every noise. He heard the sharp hiss of a man breathing through his teeth, the faint metallic clink of spurs, the shuffle of boot leather brushing dry earth. "Pick your shot," Jonah told himself, feeling the cold iron weight of grief knotting in his chest. "Like you did before it all burned." He remembered the night of the fire, The way his boys' laughter had filled the house, the scent of his wife's hair, the softness of their hands. Then came the smoke, the heat, the cruel crackle of flames. And somewhere in that inferno, Silas Crowley's voice, laughing as the world turned to ash. He'd crawled out blind, broken in ways no doctor could mend, his face seared and his eyes forever dark. The years after were filled with silence and canyons, sharpening his remaining senses, chasing the memory of his lost family and the name of the man who'd taken them. And now that reckoning had come. Another breath, another step. Jonah felt a tremor in the ground. A man to his left. He snapped the Colt up, fired, and was rewarded with a grunt and a body hitting dirt. A sudden shout came from the town. "Get him, Jonah!" It was old Hank Carter's voice, shaky but fierce, and soon others followed. From behind barrels, porch posts, and saloon windows, townsfolk who'd cowered under Crowley's rule too long took up old hunting rifles, rusted shotguns, and whatever weapons they could find. Bullets cracked across the darkness, the townspeople emboldened by the sight of one man defying death. Eleanor's chains rattled as she clawed at the rusted links with her splintered rock. Her fingers bled, her wrists raw, but she didn't stop. Each pull on the chain weakened it further. The train's whistle screamed again, closer now, deafening in the still night, the ground trembling as iron wheels tore across the rails. "Come on, come on," she whispered through gritted teeth, wrenching the chain one final time. It gave. She collapsed onto the dirt, chest heaving, then reached out for a fallen revolver glinting in the red moonlight. It felt foreign in her hand, but its weight was a comfort. On the other side of the tracks, Silas Crowley's patience snapped. "Enough!" he howled, storming from cover like a mad dog. His face twisted in fury, blood smearing one cheek from a grazing shot. He held a knife in one hand, a revolver in the other. "Come on, you blind bastard," he roared. "I'll carve your guts out myself." Jonah heard the charge, the heavy pounding of boots, the uneven breathing of a man driven past reason. He holstered his Colt, spreading his stance, waiting. Silas hit him like a charging bull, knocking both men to the ground in a tangle of limbs, dust, and blood. The knife flashed, nicking Jonah's shoulder as he rolled aside. Silas followed, fists hammering, one blow catching Jonah across the jaw. Jonah spat blood into the dirt. The pain was distant, a memory barely felt. His hands closed around Silas's wrist, forcing the knife away, and then a punch to the ribs drove the outlaw back. The two men grappled, snarling like wild animals under the blood moon's gaze. The train's headlamp grew brighter, an eye of blinding white that cut through the darkness. The engine roared closer, its scream a banshee's wail. Jonah's strength faltered as Silas drove him down, the knife inches from his throat. The world around them shrank to the press of flesh, the stink of blood and sweat, the hate in Silas's ragged breath. And then a shot cracked the night. Silas Crowley jerked upright, a look of stunned disbelief crossing his face as blood bloomed from his chest. He staggered, dropped the knife, and turned. Eleanor stood 10 paces away, the revolver trembling in her grip, her bruised face set in grim defiance. "This is for my husband," she said softly. Silas took one step toward her, then collapsed face first into the dirt. Jonah pushed himself up, bloodied and battered, his ears strained. Only a few scattered shots now, the riders breaking, running. He drew his Colt again. A footstep behind him, the sharp intake of breath. Jonah pivoted, firing blind. One of the last Crowley riders dropped dead where he stood, a clean hole between his eyes. The train screamed past, brake shrieking, steam billowing as the iron monster ground to a halt inches from where Silas's body lay. The massive engine loomed, the engineer leaning from the cab with wide, horrified eyes. What in the name of? Jonah didn't hear the rest. He lowered his Colt, his whole body aching, every old wound burning. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. From the town, people began to emerge, tentative at first, then in growing numbers. Hank Carter, Mrs. Cavanaugh, Caleb Weaver, the cowardly Marshall Avery, shamefaced and pale. Jonah felt Eleanor's presence before she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand brushing his arm. Jonah tipped his head toward her. "He took my family," he said, voice ragged. "I promised Em I'd finish it." "You did," she said, a strange, tired relief in her voice. The townsfolk gathered around them, murmuring in awe. A few started cheering. Others wept. Avery cleared his throat, trying to puff his chest out. "Well, now, with Crowley gone, we can rebuild, you know. I'll see to it." "Save your breath," Jonah growled, and Avery shut his mouth. Jonah turned to Caleb, who looked up at him with something like hero worship in his wide eyes. "Keep your head down, boy," Jonah said softly. Then, after a moment, he reached out, pressing the ivory-handled Colt into Caleb's small, trembling hands. Some legends belong to the next ones. Without another word, Jonah started down the road out of town, the blood moon lighting his path. And behind him, Redstone Gulch began to remember what it felt like to be free. Dawn crept slow over Redstone Gulch, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, softening the jagged edges of the blood-soaked night. The last of the smoke hung low over the town like a morning veil, while the tracks gleamed wet with dew and darker stains no dawn could wash away. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth had witnessed something ancient and terrible and sacred all at once. The train sat still on the rails, steam hissing softly from its great iron lungs. Crows circled overhead, their harsh cries breaking the heavy silence as the townsfolk began to emerge from doorways and battered buildings, blinking in the fragile light. Marshal Grad Avery, dusty and haggard, wasted no time. He straightened his crooked badge, smoothed back his thinning hair, and strode to the center of town with all the confidence of a man who believed the world too weary to care about truth. "Well now," he declared loudly, hands on his hips as if he'd overseen the whole bloody affair. "Thanks to swift law and order, Redstone Gulch is rid of its problem. Crowley and his riders have been dealt with, and justice is served." The townsfolk didn't cheer. They didn't even nod. One by one, their gazes slid past Avery, to where Jonah Cross stood near the bloodied tracks. His face was a mask of dried blood, dust, and old scars. The ivory-handled Colt hung at his side, streaked with powder burns and the stain of the night's work. He didn't move, didn't speak. He stood as he always had, between the living and the dead, a sentinel made of old grief and harder resolve. Caleb Weaver stepped forward, still clutching the cold Jonah had pressed into his small hands. He looked up at Avery with wide, unblinking eyes. "You didn't do nothing, Marshal," the boy said, voice small but steady. "It was Jonah Cross saved us." A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk. "Jonah and Eleanor," someone added. "She killed Silas herself," said another. "Ain't no badge stopped him. Was them two what did it." Avery's face flushed a deep, ugly red, but he said nothing. Jonah removed his hat and then, slowly, his dark glasses. It was the first time in years anyone in Redstone Gulch had seen his face unhidden, and what they saw silenced even the most stubborn tongues. His eyes were ruined, milky and scarred, clouded by the fire that had taken his family and his sight. Deep lines carved his weather-worn face, a map of a life marked by sorrow. But there was strength there, too, and something older than fear. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor stepped forward, her face still bruised, but her spine straight as a fence post. "I didn't know if you were still alive," she said softly. Jonah turned his head toward her voice, brow furrowed. "And I didn't know you existed." She managed a small, sad smile. "I was Thomas's niece by marriage. I married into the Voss family the year after it happened. When Crowley killed them, I thought I was alone. My husband, Thomas's brother, he died last year. Since then, it's just been me." Jonah's jaw clenched, a sharp breath catching in his throat. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then we're what's left." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, scarred, a hand made for violence. But he didn't pull away. In that touch, a lifetime of grief, loss, and long-delayed reckoning passed between them. "I'll keep the store," she said quietly, "and I'll keep your name safe here. What you did, what you've always done." Jonah's lips twitched in something close to a smile. The townsfolk edged closer now, shedding their fear like old skin. Hank Carter stepped forward with a battered badge in his hand, the one Avery wore never worth the metal it was stamped on. "Jonah," Hank rasped, we want you to have this. This town needs a lawman, not some coward hiding behind paperwork. You saved us once. Let be your town now." A chorus of murmured agreement rose around them. Men who had kept their heads down, women who had pulled their children inside when Crowley's riders came, all of them ready now to follow a man who'd faced down death in the dark and walked away. But Jonah shook his head. "I ain't meant for towns," he said, voice low. "My war's done, but peace ain't in me." A hush followed his words. He turned to Caleb, crouching so his blind eyes met the boy's. "Keep this safe," Jonah said, closing Caleb's hands around the colt once more. "It's yours now. You stand for what's right. You protect the weak. And you shoot straight when it's time." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight for words. Jonah rose, tipped his hat to Eleanor, and began walking. Not toward the saloon, nor the marshal's office, nor even the old road out of town. He moved east, toward the canyons, where the sun rose slow, and the wind spoke in tongues only men like him could hear. No one stopped him, and as he passed the bloody tracks, the scorched earth, the scattered bodies of Crowley's riders, the dawn broke in earnest, washing away the remnants of night. The legend of Redstone Gulch was born. By noon, word had already begun to spread. A blind gunman, returned from the dead, had faced down an outlaw gang alone. A woman, wronged and left for dead, had fired the shot that ended Silas Crowley. The cowardly marshal exposed. The people rising, finding courage in the shadow of a man long thought lost. They spoke the name Jonah Cross in every saloon, every campfire, and every dusty road between here and Delcorn Pass. Some added embellishments, said he could hear a man's heartbeat from 50 paces, or that he could shoot a man dead by the sound of his breath. Others claimed he vanished into thin air, a spirit sent by the restless dead. But those who had seen him, those who'd felt the air crackle with every draw of his colt, knew the truth was enough without gilding. At the edge of the canyons, where the rocks rose like broken teeth against the sky, Jonah Cross paused. He turned his face to the sun, feeling its warmth, listening to the land breathe. The war was over. The grief never would be. But for the first time in years, he felt a weight lift. The promise he'd made in fire and blood kept. And somewhere behind him, Redstone Gulch would heal. The narrator's voice, rough as dry timber, closes the tale. Some say he's still out there, where the canyons swallow the sun, and the wind carries the names of the dead. A blind gunman, a revenant, a man made of loss and grit and iron, waiting for justice to call his name again.